Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Modern Web Podcast. We are super excited to have some awesome folks from the NativeScript community on today. So I wanted to go ahead and introduce a few folks. We have Stanimira from the engineering team on NativeScript. And then we have Nathan Walker, who does a lot of amazing things for the community, is one of the co-founders of a company called nStudio. And then we have TJ, who does developer relations for Progress focused on NativeScript. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think, I'm familiar with NativeScript. I've used it before, and I'm really excited because I actually really love the technology and being able to develop in it. But maybe we can start off with just giving a brief introduction to what is NativeScript for the folks who don't know.
Yeah, so I can start there. So NativeScript, if you haven't heard of the framework at all, basically the simplest way I can explain it is it's a technology that lets you use JavaScript to drive native iOS and native Android apps. So if you've done any sort of iOS or Android development, you're probably familiar with how that usually works. Usually you're using Xcode and writing Swift to build for iOS. You're using Android Studio and Java to build for Android. Well, with NativeScript, your approach is a little bit different. Instead, you're using JavaScript code, but at the end of the day, you're still getting a native Android and a native iOS code base. So the real magic of NativeScript is basically a technology that lets JavaScript actually build those apps from one code base. And the idea is that we're trying to make JavaScript developers' lives really as easy as possible, or bring as many familiar tools that JavaScript developers may already know and make them available for native iOS and native Android. So this includes things like TypeScript or Angular support, or we've been working with the View community. We use NPM for dependency management, Webpack for optimization. So a lot of these tools that you associate with JavaScript development, but you don't normally associate with iOS or Android development. So that's what we try to make possible.
Awesome. And of course, everybody always has the question when looking at technologies, how is it different from something like ReactNative?
So I think the biggest difference right off the top is at the framework level. So ReactNative, as its name sort of implies, is built off of React. With NativeScript, we're in a way a little bit lower level in that NativeScript is not coupled to any specific JavaScript framework. So you can use what's called NativeScript Core, which is basically just the dependent, or the, I guess, minimal dependency version of NativeScript, where you're not actually using a JavaScript framework, but instead just using some lower level NativeScript APIs. But we also offer support for Angular and also for Vue.js. So if you do like those frameworks, you can use those alongside of NativeScript. And to sort of take a step back, I think when you're talking about NativeScript versus React Native, certainly if you were organizing frameworks, you would certainly put NativeScript and React Native into the same bucket. What they're doing at a high level is very similar. Both are technologies that let you use JavaScript to run iOS or Android apps. So the first difference is at the framework level. I think that's sort of the easier one. But either Mira or Nathan, do you want to dive into some of the little more technical sides of where the frameworks differ? You want to chime in here at all?
We always love to hear from Stanimira. Stanimira, you go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So another big difference that comes to my mind is that, just to say that I'm not a React Native expert, but with NativeScript, you have 100% access to the native APIs to Android and iOS. And with that said, you can use any Android or iOS library out there in your NativeScript apps directly. And in React Native, it's a bit different because you have to write some kind of wrappers around the native APIs in order to be able to use them. That's one difference that comes to my mind. And what else? I don't know. Nathan, have you actually built some stuff with React Native?
I have actually. So I'll say probably the biggest thing is kind of the ergonomics. Like from a developer standpoint, when you're developing something that's unique with NativeScript is this kind of raw access to the native API. So there really isn't a wrapper. So when you develop against any feature on iOS or Android, you really are developing against that hardware, if you will. So the ergonomics are different in that sense. So TJ is very right in saying it's kind of a level lower than React Native, because you're kind of dealing on the direct API level. In that same vein, it's also synchronous. So as you access those native APIs, they're synchronous. And you get back objects that are marshaled in real time from the native platform. And I'd say that's probably a big difference to React Native, because React Native, you are generally shuttling a message and getting back an object. And currently it had been asynchronous, but they're doing some work to make a synchronous layer currently, which may have similar implications like NativeScript, but I don't think the ergonomics will be the same.
That's super cool. And, one of the reasons we bring this up is not because it's a framework, war or anything like that, but more because I think it's really cool to understand how the different technologies work under the hood. And I know that I get this question a lot of, who doesn't, right? What's the difference between Vue and Angular? What's the difference between React?
A metaphor kind of comes to mind when I think of the two. And like when you develop for the browser, you think what's awesome and that we all love about JavaScript is you write it in JavaScript. It runs, of course, in Chrome, runs in Firefox, runs in IE. And of course, the browser, they seem like these different areas that you're targeting that your code can run on, but you're writing in this singular language, which is JavaScript, right? NativeScript kind of has that same spirit, if you will, for iOS and Android. So if you're ever developing for both those platforms, it can be time consuming, and also can be a little frustrating because the philosophies are so different between the two platforms. And so NativeScript kind of brings that JavaScript spirit to that development for iOS and Android, because it gives you a singular language and components that you can code against iOS and Android in a similar way.
Yes. I do love it. I remember how easy it was for me to get started in Angular, just doing NativeScript and Angular together. It was very nice. So there have been, the team has been doing a lot lately, and I know there's been, I think there's new releases coming, but I think there was just a more recent release. I don't know if you all want to talk about that. I know. TJ, you said that you might want to talk about code sharing.
Yeah, so I can sort of intro this topic, and I know the other two on this call could talk about this pretty extensively. So I think I'll just sort of introduce this and let those two take it from there. But a long time, basically in technology times, 2 years feels like forever. But a while ago, we introduced compatibility with NativeScript with Angular. We announced it at NGConf a few years ago, and it was because there was enormous demand from our community that they wanted to be able to use a front-end framework that they knew, that they're familiar with, to build with NativeScript. And part of the reason behind that is people wanted the ability to actually directly share code between their web apps and their native apps. After all, it's one language. And if you're using, for example, Angular, there's even one framework or one series of APIs that you're coding to. So there's really no reason why you can't use your code on these two different platforms, especially when you're talking things like services or model objects or these sorts of things. The code is, in most cases, literally identical. So the actual act of making that happen, though, has been an interesting story, because you have to, if you're, and I should say from a higher level, another thing that came up pretty much immediately after we announced this is a lot of people, and Nathan especially here, we're trying to build projects that let you build for all these platforms from one code base, meaning you have one project, and out of that project, you can spit out a web app, you can spit out an iOS app, and you can spit out an Android app. Now, some of the challenges with that has been, okay, well, when you do need to branch your code, where is the stuff that's specifically for web and native, and how do those fit in there? How are we going to approach this? So the thing we announced fairly recently is that we've been working with the Angular team to basically build in compatibility with the Angular CLI to do some of this for you. So if you use ng-new, you build a new Angular app, there's now some conventions and some APIs that you can use to build for all three platforms from one code base. So that's sort of what's new. And I think I've been talking for a while here, so I'm going to turn it over to these other two. Nathan, maybe you could talk next about sort of, because I know you've been involved with some of these projects that have tried to make this happen over the years.
Yeah, I think for myself, I was brief short story. Portland, Oregon was with a startup, and we were doing wind forms on top of JavaScript and shuttling messages to a desktop application, and it worked really well, but it obviously was a maintenance nightmare, right? So there had always been this excitement for JavaScript to kind of be the solution for bridging a lot of these technologies together. And in that startup, for myself, really saw a lot of opportunities with JavaScript and hopefulness that we could bring that all together. So I think we were also doing mobile apps, but we were doing pure Objective-C. This was maybe 10 years ago. So at the same time, we had all this JavaScript code. And so, yeah, I think when NativeScript came out, I remember being pretty excited about this immediate possibility that you could also bring together mobile in together with even other things that you were doing on the web. And so I would say when Angular 2 came out and it was cross-platform ready and you could bring these together, that kind of naturally evolved this this excitement where Angular could kind of serve as this solid base of JavaScript or TypeScript. And of course, NativeScript has been written in TypeScript since day one, I believe. Stanimira can speak more to that. But so this idea that you could bring them all together was just really exciting. And I think that's just kind of evolved into this story of code sharing, which is probably one of the really exciting aspects of NativeScript because, again, that singular approach, the consistency to the language using JavaScript / TypeScript to code your projects, but also be able to target best-of-class performance on these various deployments is just something that's really exciting. And Stanimira, you might speak a little bit to, actually, I'm real other curious with TypeScript. When the native team started with TypeScript, this was before Angular or the modern rewrite of Angular, or was it somewhere right in the same time frame?
Sorry, I couldn't really hear the question. Can you repeat it?
Sure. So TypeScript, the choice to use TypeScript with the NativeScript framework, did that come prior to Angular's rewrite and the decision to use TypeScript there? Because I know at the time there was something called @script, and I was curious if that was even a thing that you all had looked at. And I know you're probably haven't been there since day one, but maybe you know some of that.
Yeah, that was actually a decision that was made before my time in NativeScript, but I know that we decided to use TypeScript before any other framework started using it. So NativeScript was basically the first big framework out there to be developed in TypeScript. And I'm not sure what was the exact reason, but I think most of the team members, the people who built NativeScript, were writing C# before that. So coming into the JavaScript world, having type safety and classes and interfaces and stuff like that was really a better option than writing plain JavaScript, especially when you know that you're going to be building a huge framework with a really large code base, and you know that type safety is something that really matters to you.
So if everyone out there can relate to this real quick and figure that the NativeScript team's been writing with TypeScript probably in pre-1.0 when they were still forming TypeScript a bit, and you could imagine the trials and tribulations they went through as TypeScript had matured over time. So these are hardened engineers over there.
So it's funny because back in I want to say, so NativeScript first was released in March of 2015. That was sort of the public beta, and I got involved with NativeScript a little bit before we went live. And I remember, I still have the email I wrote. I made an argument, vehemently arguing against TypeScript, that TypeScript was the wrong move. I made this argument that like TypeScript's this like Microsoft thing, and Microsoft's not cool with the JavaScript world. And it's funny because I could not, time has proven me so wrong, right? In terms of like everything that I said, like TypeScript, since I sent that, has just been on the skyrocket. Because my argument was things like, no one really knows TypeScript, right? I don't want to be using this niche thing for NativeScript because I want it to have broad appeal, and the JavaScript community doesn't know TypeScript and things like that. And over time, TypeScript's rise has been crazy, and it's still going up, and the tooling has gotten better. And now I look at it as TypeScript's basically a necessity for most of the development I do nowadays. So it's funny how things can change in a short amount of time.
Bringing that into NativeScript and this ability to access the synchronous ability to access the native platforms. The typing is really important there, as most might imagine, because a lot of the languages that are being interacted with NativeScript, Objective-C, Swift, and Java and Kotlin, those are typed languages. So yeah, the TypeScript base layer to access those is definitely probably critical to NativeScript success and evolution.
Totally, yeah. And I think that the best thing about TypeScript is really the tooling. And of course, VS Code, which basically supports TypeScript since the beginning. And I know, I'm not sure which one came first, but they're really a great couple.
Yeah, it even plays into as well, because with NativeScript, another thing we've talked about is the difference between NativeScript and ReactNative. And when we were talking there, one of the big differences is that we allow you to access raw iOS and Android APIs directly in your code. So in ReactNative, I think to set the stage for people that are less familiar is, suppose you're building in your iOS or your Android app, and you need some API that's like very custom. Like you find something on the internet, you need your iOS app to do, I don't know. Give me an example, somebody. What's a random iOS-y thing you might need to do? Mess with the status bar, right? You see like, hey, my status bar needs to be this color. Looks like there's some Swift APIs for doing this. So in React Native, typically your approach to do this is they have these APIs that are sort of kind of known as the bridge, that you essentially write Objective-C or Swift code. You write ways of communicating between JavaScript and Swift, going back and forth. So your JavaScript would sort of tie into the native code back and forth. Well, in NativeScript, you have the ability to just straight up access those APIs right in your TypeScript code. If the iOS APIs exist, they're sitting right there for you. So you don't have this disconnect between your TypeScript code and your native code over here. But the challenge, and why I'm bringing it up now, is that most JavaScript, TypeScript developers don't know iOS or Android APIs. These are unfamiliar APIs. These aren't things that they know what they are. So the fact that we're using TypeScript means you get a lot of the same code completion that you would get if you were working in something like Xcode or Android Studio or Visual Studio, or it makes the NativeScript development more like the IDEs you'd be used to be doing native development. So in a way, TypeScript's almost a necessity for working within the NativeScript architecture, and the fact that you have access to those APIs when you need them.
Face ID is a good example of this. When iPhone X came out and there's the Face ID support, this is an example of a native platform feature that comes out with a brand new phone. And of course, both vendors love to come out with these brand new hardware features. And there's these new APIs with the iOS updates that come out that allow you to access these things. Because NativeScript has this direct access, you have that 0-day support and ability to access that new API the day it comes out. And so Face ID is an example of that. The second that device came out and there was Face ID, you could access that and interact with that feature that day.
Oh my gosh, there's so many exciting things to know, I think, about NativeScript and the new things. And I feel like the team there has been so amazing at just continuously pushing the ball forward and everything. What's the deal with NativeScript and View these days?
So right now with NativeScript and View, so I guess the broader perspective here is that NativeScript, we're not coupled to any specific framework. So if any framework out there that is not tied to the DOM or HTML, because in NativeScript, we're using native user interfaces. So you can't use things like jQuery with NativeScript because jQuery is a DOM-based framework. You can't use Angular 1 with NativeScript because it's DOM-based. But any framework that is not tied to the DOM, so that includes Angular, that includes React, that includes Vue, can be used with NativeScript. It's just a matter of writing the code to make these sort of things possible. So with Angular, back 2 years ago, we had enormous demand. So we built the Angular integration in-house, and Mira was a big part of making that happen. And that's something that we maintain in an official capacity to this day. Vue actually started as a community initiative. So it's kind of a fun open source story that you put this framework out there, and the number of people from the Vue community found it, thought, hey, it would be cool if NativeScript worked with Vue, and just basically hit the ground running with that. And that's sort of where that is today. But NativeScript Vue has been growing in popularity by quite a bit recently. So we've started to put some resources on NativeScript specifically on helping NativeScript Vue happen, help block or help the team when they hit blocking issues and so forth. And basically, we're just watching it grow, seeing more and more people use Vue.
That's kind of amazing that it can be enabled for anything. And I'm pretty sure, and I can't remember, maybe y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, but the NativeScript View path kind of happened because somebody from the community kind of decided to do it anyways. Was that kind of how it began, or?
Yep, it's Igor. Can anybody pronounce his last name? I don't want to butcher it on a podcast. Nathan, you're going to take a shot at it? I see you making a face.
Nathan can butcher it.
I am. I've actually mispronounced it with him before. Go on.
But anyways, pretty amazing story that basically he just took it without necessarily any help from us initially, and just wanted to see if he could make the framework happen. And like I said, the raw APIs are all there with NativeScript. I mean, if you dig in deep enough, NativeScript's APIs are pretty low level, and there's a lot that you could build on top of it. I think the challenge is the reason why, because another question we get a lot is, well, why don't you support React, and why don't you support Ember, and why don't you support, insert 5 other JavaScript frameworks, is that there's also a lot of effort from just a straight documentation perspective, a maintenance perspective, templates. I mean, there's a lot of work that goes in from our end to supporting these frameworks, especially in some sort of official capacity. So I think our stance right now has been, we've taken on Angular. Angular is going to be a framework that we support. And we're also offering, like, if anybody else wants to make framework support happen in NativeScript, we're happy to help them make that happen, and to clear blocking issues and such. And that's sort of the stance we've taken with NativeScript View. And I mean, so far it's working out pretty well.
If I could segue that back for a moment to Angular for a moment, I will say that I was an Angular developer before I got into NativeScript, and that integration was what really piqued my interest initially. And what's really exciting about working with Angular and NativeScript together is that when you're developing with it, it feels just like natural Angular development. All of the bindings, even with the view, even though you're dealing with slightly different markup there because you're not dealing with the DOM, your approach to development is the same in terms of the rich component building, the service architecture that you can build in with Angular, the routing, all that's integrated in. So it does feel very natural, I think, to most Angular developers. And I'll always say one of the most underutilized features of Angular and NativeScript together is directives. There's so many exciting opportunities to do really interesting feature work just by utilizing Angular directives on top of NativeScript views. There's also, we just did one as a team yesterday related to a blur effect, and it's just amazing some of the effects and things you can do with just Angular directives in NativeScript.
I want to see more in terms of directives for native and web too. I think that's like, because directives are cross-platform sort of by definition, and there's no reason that you couldn't like define an API and then implement it twice. So I think the possibilities are pretty cool.
They are, and they can even be platform specific too. And that's a thing. Like you could have a directive that even was specifically for iOS that tapped in, and you could make a layout container actually do all sorts of platform specific effects and that sort of thing with just directives. But certainly Angular and NativeScript is a strong combo. I know Jen's been taking the NativeScript in Vue much further, And I know Igor's been the main contributor for NativeScript View. And so, yeah, I've been curious on routing in NativeScript View. Do Stanimira and TJ, do y'all know about routing in View?
So the latest I've heard is, like you said, we're trying to integrate it with the sort of Vue conventions. And I'm not from the Vue world, but I think it's the like Vuex router. And I think that's the major upcoming feature with the next release, is trying to integrate it with that. But I'm not intimately familiar with where that's at. But I know the plan is to make it work the same with Angular. So at NativeScript Angular, basically the same router you use for your native apps or for your web apps can more or less be used for your native apps. Pretty much. There's some trivial differences in terms of like your iOS or Android app. Maybe you want different native transitions, maybe some different configurations, but the APIs are about the same. And I know that's the plan for Vue, to make the same thing happen, but I'm not, sure on the exact progress.
Stanimira, I'm curious from the internal team's perspective, as far as maintaining and supporting these frameworks. Are there different segments of the team focused on each integration? How it must be a challenge to balance the resources across the framework support. Curious, any insight there?
Yeah, we do have different teams or different people working on the different aspects of the framework. Obviously, I am mostly working on the integration with Angular, and my team, that's the modules team, is working on the TypeScript abstraction over the native APIs. And we're also maintaining the Webpack plugin and things like that. We've been involved in the code sharing story, because that's really tied to Angular. And we also have a few other teams. We're actually quite a lot of people now that I think of it, around 20, 25 people on the core teams, and maybe 20 more that are working on tooling. So yeah, NativeScript is pretty big. So we have another 2 teams that are working on the NativeScript runtime, the Android runtime and the iOS runtime. We have a team that's dedicating for supporting plugins and helping our community build more plugins and develop the ecosystem around NativeScript. And yeah, I think we have some people from the team that are starting more and more to help with the Vue integration, and especially the routing that you mentioned. And there is a pretty big release coming in NativeScript Vue. I think it's 2.0. But yeah, I'm not really into the Vue world either.
One thing that impresses me about Progress and NativeScript and what's supported here is that portions of their team are just as knowledgeable about iOS, Swift, and even Java and Kotlin, and they send folks to these conferences to be up to date on the latest of what's coming out. And I know recently 2 members from their team were at WWDC, and it's just impressive that their approach is to be as up to date and cutting edge on all of those technologies for the purpose of making sure that TypeScript and JavaScript ability to access those is as tight as possible. It's impressive.
It's one of the challenges with just working in this space, is that you almost have to have expertise in iOS, Android, and the web world. So you also have to know really in depth how the Angular framework works, how Webpack works, which we use fairly extensively. I see Mira smiling because she's very familiar with how deep our knowledge goes there. And it's challenging in the sense that, I mean, we get people asking questions and having issues in really all levels of those spaces, right? So you could have someone that hits some weird issue working with iOS simulators, or someone can't get a specific Android SDK up and running. So the team, in a way, is segmented in a way to try to have expertise in those individual areas. And then we try to abstract that so your actual end user that's using it doesn't necessarily need to be an expert in any of those spaces, because that's really the value proposition of NativeScript. Is we don't want to force you to necessarily be an expert in all of this. And we want to make iOS or Android as easy as we reasonably can, or at least try to make your life a little bit easier when you're building for these platforms. But from an internal perspective, that can be challenging at times, to say the least.
Mira, can you tell us about NativeScript 5.0?
Oh yeah, that's a big thing. So I think we haven't announced that officially, but we have a major release coming at the end of October, right, DJ?
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. So we have a lot of exciting new things that we're working on currently. I'm not sure if we can share a lot about some of the secret things, but we're definitely looking into developing more decode sharing story, also improving the getting started experience. So you won't have to have any native setup for Android or iOS. You just will have the NativeScript CLI, and you can start using NativeScript just with one node package. And yeah, I think we have plenty of new features.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. What did you say?
I'm just teasing you.
Is this along the lines of like a Docker container, or is this like a 2 GB NPM package?
No, not really. Okay, I can share a bit more about it. So we have these NativeScript playgrounds, which is basically something like a web IDE that allows you to develop your app in the browser and then sync it to your app. So we won't have a similar experience with the NativeScript CLI that you just install on your machine, and then you can start building the app, and the app is synced on your phone automatically, and the app is already pre-built. And you just change the JavaScript parts of it or add some new plugins and stuff.
Wow, very cool.
Yeah, that's going to make me so happy because it just makes it, oh, yes. Can we have it now? So October. Did you hear that? Mira just totally committed, TJ.
Yeah, exactly. End of October. Write it in stone.
You got a couple good beta testers right here, so that's exciting.
Nathan's like, give it to me now.
We'll help clear. No, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Stanimira.
And really, too, like a lot of the most common issues we have with people starting with NativeScript is just getting started using NativeScript. So in terms of, Android and iOS can be complicated places. And because we're using NativeScript at the end of the day is spitting out iOS and Android apps. Like we're not doing, web apps that look iOS and Android. And they're like, no, they're native apps. They're .apk files for Android. They're .ipa files for iOS. And that means we have to go through the exact same setup that iOS and Android developers have to, because we're using the exact same build tools. And that means Android SDK installation. That means Xcode. That means Gradle, just CocoaPods, all these things I'm thinking of off the top of my head. And that can be challenging for someone to set up because we're mostly talking to web developers and JavaScript developers, and they don't probably have a full Android development environment set up and ready to go. And so the idea behind Playground is just, we want to make it easy. We just code locally and be able to see that app instantly on your device without having to mess with any of that. And I mean, eventually you will have to go through the full setup at some point when you get to the production state of your app, when you're actually ready to go to the app stores. But we don't want that to get in your way when you're just trying to see how Hello World works in NativeScript and tinker with a few plugins.
We might touch on this just a moment, and that is the native development background and the understanding of that. And of course, the Playground being kind of a push to abstract some of that away. There are times, and I think this is a similarity with React Native, and that is that understanding some bits about the platform you're developing for can be beneficial at times. And I'd say that's probably one of the more challenging aspects that most purists from the web community coming into it will run into, because there are aspects to it that having some bit of understanding on iOS, the platform itself, and how it handles things, things like the notifications and how it shuttles some messaging around whenever you want to do some deeper integrations. Also like the animation frameworks natively on both Android and iOS. iOS has a pretty sophisticated animation framework that's matured as well over a long period of time. and like core graphics, you know, when you're talking Cocoa, and these things that have kind of matured, NativeScript is interacting with those. And so there are some integrations that you get into, depending on how deep you go with your development for those platforms, that certainly understanding some bits about that are beneficial. But what's exciting about NativeScript in that sense is that even if you are new to some of those paradigms, it kind of introduces you to some of those in such a way that could be friendlier, because you're getting some IntelliSense against some of those things, because it's using TypeScript. So you can actually explore this kind of entirely new world. It's like dropping in a totally different browser in a way, and you get this IntelliSense against this whole new world that is totally new, and of course has been around for a long time now. But there's just a lot to experiment and play with once you get into a NativeScript, because you got IntelliSense against all these APIs that just were not at your fingertips before.
Yeah, and I mostly tell most people that with NativeScript, I mean, we try to abstract away the messy parts of iOS or Android, or the more complicated parts. And we usually tell people to stick to the happy path, at least to start, right? Like NativeScript, you're not necessarily writing iOS or Android code by default. You're writing in these cross-platform abstractions that we create with NativeScript. But as Nathan says, having that native development expertise will pay off in a big way. So it's things like being able to step outside of the box with NativeScript to really customize your app. Well, if you know how some of these APIs work, you'll be able to do far more powerful things. I mean, in NativeScript, we can only abstract so much, and knowing the raw power of these native platforms can really help. And I'd say also that it's not just in the APIs, but just having some Android and iOS knowledge in terms of how emulators work, how simulators work, how the App Store works, how Google Play works, how you deploy apps, because those are things you're going to need to know at some point with NativeScript as well. Again, we try to make these things as easy as possible, but you know, we can't iTunes Connect for you. It's a process that you're going to have to learn and get familiar with. So with NativeScript, we certainly encourage people to be familiar with some of these native development methodologies, because partly because you're going to need some of them, and also because you can just do a lot more if you have that background or that expertise.
Here's a quick concrete example that my team have worked on here in an app. The background networking layer. So each platform has a network stack involved, right? And this particular client we were working for, they needed to actually upload a video in the background, even if the user puts the app in the background and goes on and does other things. In the web, you could upload things and the user could put the browser in the background, and it might go for a little while, but it wouldn't be guaranteed that that networking stack at that point, once the JavaScript engine in the browser is put in the background, would actually get canceled. And so, you know, a fundamental thing that this client needed to do in this app is they needed to assure that these video uploads would continue even if the user left the app and went on and did something else on their phone. And that was just a fundamental thing that we couldn't bridge with 100% assurance using just web alone. And so this is where NativeScript was able to step in, and we could actually handle that with the native networking stack to actually ensure that that video, no matter if that app is back there, continue to upload without problem.
And I'll say one last thing, since we're running out of time. It's been, well, so first off, you can find all these folks on Twitter, which is super awesome. But if it wasn't for the NativeScript folks in the community who are visible and who were willing to just help on Twitter, I would not have gotten excited or even thought about using NativeScript as a technology. So it's kind of funny, right? Because I think with technology, sometimes it's, hey, what are my friends doing? Hey, let me try that. So I wanted to thank all of you all for being there, and, you know, for me to get to know you all, and Sebastian as well, who was the first person who sort of like taught me NativeScript in a sense, who's another really awesome person who does DevRel in the NativeScript community. So any last words, TJ?
Yeah, so if you're interested in trying NativeScript, head to nativescript.org. There's a big get started button that'll jump out at you. You'll want to click that. It'll take you to NativeScript Playground that we talked about earlier, and it'll also jump you straight into a little mini tutorial that'll just teach you the absolute basics of NativeScript. So if any of this that you heard today interests you, nativescript.org, get started, give it a try.
Yeah, I'll also say that the docs are really awesome and really easy, and I really like working through the what is it? Is it how to make it? Is it a cookbook or is it? Can't remember what it actually is, but
Are you thinking groceries?
yeah, maybe that's it. Yes, and I think TJ, you worked on that, right?
A couple of us have, yeah. So it's built in. It's one of the tutorials that if you go through that workflow, you'll end up going through. So excellent.
Yeah, I love it. It just makes it so easy. I always use NativeScript as the documentation as an example when I think about really good docs. So thank you team for that.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you again for listening to this episode of the Modern Web Podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks, Tracy.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.